Morning, everyone.
Morning.
As Chris just said, I'm Lenny, Lenny Bernstein, health and medicine reporter for the Post. My guest, as all of you know, Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker was a member of the President's Commission on Opioids. He proposed, and your legislature passed, the nation's first limit on prescriptions, first-time prescriptions for opioid drugs at 10 days. And 7, sorry.
If I hadn't said that, Secretary Sutters would have.
She would have just announced it, right?
Right.
Okay. And I was going to say that he remains adamantly opposed to the benching of Malcolm Butler during the entire Super Bowl. So I hear. So we've had almost relentless bad news over the past several years on the opioid epidemic. One of the few places where good news is coming out is Massachusetts. Your overdose rate is down. As we said, your prescription rate is down because of that great 7-day limit. And the number of tablets that are being prescribed is down. How are you accomplishing what's going on in Massachusetts right now?
Well, first of all, almost all the information that came out recently, which was the 2017 data, which was an improvement for the first time in many years over the previous year in a number of areas, was referred to in the media, and I think this is the right term, as sort of a muted commentary. I mean, I think our view is if you see something where it gets worse by double digits every single year for a really long time, and then all of a sudden your prescriptions move down, you have millions of prescribers, or hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of prescribers using your prescription monitoring program for the millions of prescriptions they're writing virtually all the time, and you see a big drop in prescriptions, and you see some leveling off in overdoses and a decline for the first time in a very long time in deaths. You know, compared to the trend, that's all positive, but I would say that where we are is still very much in the middle of this, and we have a long way to go. And I do think the legislation that you mentioned previously that we worked with the legislature on, which included things like requiring all prescribers as part of their continuing education program to take and pass a course in opioid therapy and pain management, and some significant increases in support for treatment and recovery services, and a first investment in school-based assessment programming for middle school and high school kids, and a whole bunch of stuff in the prevention and education space that was designed to help inform patients, coaches, families, practitioners, sort of everybody involved in this mix. I think all that stuff has helped, but there's nobody in Massachusetts, I don't think, who is doing anything other than sort of breathing a sigh of relief and recognizing that this means some of the things we're doing seem to be working, but we have miles and miles to go.
Folks, I should remind you that if you have questions, and we would really love to take them, please tweet them to and use the hashtag #PostLive, and I'll get them on the tablet and pose them to the governor. So, as you say, the epidemic continues. It's still bad, and most of it is fentanyl. I think 80% of the folks who overdosed in your state and in many other places over the past year or so have fentanyl in their systems. Nationally, the number of fentanyl overdose deaths more than doubled last year. What are you doing here about fentanyl? What can you do here about fentanyl?
Yeah, so the fentanyl and the movement on fentanyl is significant. And you know, as recently as 2014, fentanyl was present in about 30% of the overdose deaths in Massachusetts. And as you point out, in 17, it was present in over 80% of the deaths. I mean, it is clearly a major force in both overdoses and deaths. And a big part of what we're doing there is working with our colleagues in the federal government and with our colleagues in local law enforcement. And the good news there, okay, it's kind of a similar story. The good news there, there have been a whole series of very significant interventions on the law enforcement side. A lot of people trafficking in enormous quantities of fentanyl have been arrested and their products been taken off the streets. But the size of some of these drug busts speaks to just how much of this is currently in our communities. And I would say one of the things that we've been talking to the local Justice Department folks about is doing more, because part of the problem with fentanyl is it travels through a whole series of relatively hard to identify transportation networks to get here. One of the biggest of which is the mail. I mean, it's an odorless and element that you literally can put inside a paper bag or a brown wrapped box, and
Small
off it
envelope.
goes. Yeah, exactly.
Just comes in from
Right.
the mail. So what do we do?
I think you have to do everything you can to try and take as much of it off the street as possible. But I would also argue that you still need to think about this as a prevention education exercise, as well as a treatment and recovery exercise, and recognize that this threat is there. And for us, that means things like the second piece of legislation we filed, which is designed to create sort of a structured program around recovery coaching and taking something that a lot of people have started to incorporate into the treatment and recovery world, and create some standards and some structure around it, so that we can create what I would describe as a more robust and supported and clinically designed approach to long-term recovery. Because one of the things most people say about folks who are dealing with opioids is it's not the kind of thing that somebody's going to lick in a short period of time. You have to create some framework to actually help them get better and to stay with them over time. And there are a lot of folks who have started to see some benefit with recovery coaches. We created a pilot program where we embedded recovery coaches in a number of emergency rooms to see if somebody who's been there and done that, and a lot of the recovery coaches tend to be people who are in recovery themselves, would be in a position to engage people who overdosed and to say, I'm in recovery, can we sort of talk about maybe having you get into recovery at this point in time? And again, the results are preliminary and it doesn't involve a big sample size at this point, but we have seen some significant positive development in those interactions, translating into people moving into treatment, and now the key is we have to figure out how to get them to stay in treatment.
I've seen people go straight from the emergency room right back out to the street.
Yeah.
and just avoid treatment.
We have some stuff in our legislation on that too. I mean, I think the data on people who overdose, needing to find a path into treatment, is pretty powerful with respect to, once you get to the point where you've overdosed several times, you're somebody we really need to figure out a way to get into treatment, because you've got, you're heading down a road that in many cases leads to a very bad place.
Well, one of the things you proposed is a 72-hour involuntary hold for people, where you would be allowed, against a person's will, to put them in treatment. Can you tell us how that would work and how people's rights would be protected?
So in Massachusetts, you can currently be civilly committed for if you are viewed as an immediate danger to yourself or someone else. And that's been in place for years. It's called a section. And we built this using a similar framework, both from a legal construct and also from an operating point of view, to put this notion in place. We spent a bunch of time talking to clinicians in the ERs, to hospitals, to folks who run treatment programs, and said, how do we figure out some way to create a handoff, for lack of a better word, for somebody who comes in, overdoses, gets stabilized, It makes it possible for somebody to use the same legal framework for all intents and purposes that we already have for people who are a danger to themselves on the mental health side, and put these folks into a treatment program for 72 hours. Now, if after 72 hours they basically say, not interested, they can leave the program.
Well, would you have to show that someone was a danger to themselves in order to put them into that program, or?
Well, yeah, I guess the theory there would be that if you are somebody who has overdosed and nearly killed yourself several times, you're getting to the point where it's pretty clear that we should at least try to get you to take seriously the treatment idea. And this is where, by the way, I do think the recovery coaches, particularly the ones we've piloted, have turned out to be pretty effective ambassadors for treatment generally for folks who are in those situations. But it's really hard to get somebody who's in the throes of this, who's probably been Narcaned and therefore is in a really bad place emotionally and psychologically, to buy into the idea of treatment at that point. And the thought was 72 hours in a treatment program. Again, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But the one thing I've heard over and over again from a lot of the folks I've talked to in the addiction community is you don't know necessarily when treatment is going to stick.
It could be the third relapse, it could be the fourth relapse.
Could be, and almost everybody I've talked to in this space, family members and others, have all said to me exactly that, that the point at which it stuck was a very hard thing to predict, and that you had to presume that there would be relapses, bumps in the road along the way. And I said this when I testified about this issue before the legislature. You know, we all grow up being told by our parents, by our teachers, by our coaches, by almost everybody, that failure is part of success, that there are always obstacles and setbacks in achieving anything of great significance. We hear that all the time. It's a cliche. I happen to believe it's true, but it's a cliche. When we get into this area of treatment and recovery, somehow we sometimes forget that.
You're supposed to succeed the first time.
Exactly. We forget that we've told people for years and years that, you know, failure is part of getting there. And I think particularly for people who are battling an opioid addiction, for many of them, it simply wouldn't be surprising if it took more than one try to get from here to there. And I think we should incorporate that in the way we think about treatment generally. We've put 1,100 treatment beds up over the course of the past several years. We're going to put another 500 up. But we really need to also figure out this sort of continuing support model for folks over time, so that they have what I would describe as sort of the consultative services that go with, in some cases, medication-assisted treatment of one kind or another, to help them stay on the path to recovery and with the program.
I mean, people relapse in other areas, in dieting and with other diseases.
Yeah.
You do not hold it against them.
Yes, exactly.
You are opposed, or at least openly skeptical, about supervised consumption sites. Places where...
I hadn't heard him called that before. Is that a new term? Yeah,
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Where people bring their...
For those who've never heard that one before, I think he's talking about safe injection sites. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Supervised consumption sites.
People bring their drugs in off the street. They are given clean needles. They are given clean other kinds of equipment if they're cooking or they're smoking. But most importantly, of course, they are being watched and supervised by people with naloxone and oxygen in case they overdose. And inevitably, people do. I went up to Vancouver. They have 29 of these now in British Columbia. And quite a few are just popping up in tents in Vancouver itself. Tell us why you feel the way you feel about those those kinds of places.
Well, first thing we should remember is they're illegal in the United States, which is, most people would call that a bit of a roadblock.
And yet, some cities are saying they're going to open one regardless of the law.
We have some very interesting dynamics going on between state and local and federal government these days on all kinds of things. My data on this is relatively old. I do think folks in our administration who are going to be on the West Coast are going to take a trip up to Vancouver and see what's going on up there. My biggest concern with it is there was very little information that suggested that this was a path to treatment. And I am really interested in paths to treatment because our goal here should be to get people into treatment. Everybody I've ever talked to who's in this space has never said to me that this is the way they want to live the rest of their life. And I think part of what we need to focus on here is treatment. And I'm not, the last time I checked in on this, and I'll be the first to admit my data is old, there was very little evidence that this was a pathway to treatment.
I think that's true, but I also think the folks up there would say to you, there is no path to treatment until we keep these people alive, day after day after day. They've never had an overdose death in one of these. Whereas, as we discussed at the beginning, you have many overdose deaths and people are,
are they still operating as anonymous operations?
No, not in Canada.
No, I mean, like the people who go there.
The one I was at, you do not have to leave your name.
So how do you know that they may not have overdosed that time, but how do you know that they aren't people who've overdosed in some other setting after that?
Well, a lot of them are coming back day after day after day, and it gives them a level of comfort where they're actually taking the drugs in a clean and supervised environment, and they know if they go down, somebody's going to jump on them. There's one operating anonymously in the United States. We don't know where it is, but
anonymously in the United States.
Underground, yeah, according to the research.
Okay.
I get emails every time I write a story or every time the subject comes up in the Post, and I bet you get these every day. And they're from people who say, I'm in pain. If I don't get my drugs, I don't function. I can't get out of this chair. I don't take a lot, but I do take it, and I take it on a regular basis. And your work is going to make it impossible for me to get my drugs, and you're sentencing me to a life of pain. Now, the research tells us beyond 12 weeks that may not be the truth, but it is certainly the way many people that I hear from feel. Do you get those kinds of emails and letters from people, and what do you say to them?
So, first of all, we should all respect the fact that people in chronic long-term pain are playing an incredibly messy and difficult hand to begin with. And that's why the legislation we proposed was a 7-day limit on first prescriptions, with, by the way, a pretty decent exception opportunity for prescribers if they felt it was critical that that person get more than that. And it's presumed by us and by others that the chronic pain is a different issue. And I've read the same literature you have that says that there's not a lot of evidence that it works for people after a certain period of time. But I think when I think about how we got into this situation, some of it was about chronic pain, but a lot of it was about wildly overprescribing for short-term stuff. And this message about, keep taking it, stay ahead of the pain and keep taking it. And that just led a lot of people who were actually going through withdrawal to think they were actually still dealing with the pain associated with whatever the circumstance was that led them to get the prescription in the first place.
When in fact they may just be sensitive to pain as a result of their withdrawal symptoms.
Right. So I do think we didn't get this in the statute, but we got agreements from our medical schools, nursing schools, social work schools, dental schools, and pharmacy schools to build into their core curriculum opioid therapy and pain management, because I do think there's a whole generation of practitioners out there who were never really trained around any of this stuff, which creates part of the issue as well. And one of the things that's in this legislation we filed was to work with folks in the pharmacy community and in the medical community, see if we can't come up with a blister pack for really small, wisdom teeth, small time, what I would describe as small time stuff, where why anybody would write somebody a 30 or a 60-day supply for something like that is beyond me. And if we could give them a tool that made it possible for them to write a much smaller dose that would be more consistent with what they would probably want to give this to this person if they had a tool available to them, I think they would.
I think at least now they're thinking about, why am I giving 30 or 60?
Well, hopefully, for that that short-term stuff. On the longer-term stuff, we actually had a bunch of pain folks, clinicians and advocates in for a conversation to talk about, well, help us understand what some of the alternatives might be, and how can we incorporate those alternatives into either the way our mass health program works, or the way our coverage policies work for commercial insurance. And I got to tell you, one of the things that came out of that conversation, for me anyway, was, as a layperson, is pain's a very complicated issue, and it's not clear to me that you can think about it in a broad stroke. That for long-term chronic pain, there are a lot of different elements at work here, and what we probably need to do is make sure that we have as many of the tools available to people as possible, and let folks try and figure out which ones work best for them. But on the really short-term acute stuff, I really do believe that being careful and cautious with this stuff is a big part of what we need to be doing with respect to prevention and education. For the folks who give me and you apparently a hard time on, justifiably, with respect to the binary conversations they seem to be having with some folks in the provider community about their situations, I talk to people all the time who say, I had a minor procedure, and my provider, doctor, dentist, whatever, wanted to write me a 30-day supply. I said I didn't want a 30-day supply. They said, take it. I said, I don't want it. They said, take it. And they walked out the door with a 30-day supply, and in many cases they don't fill it. We do now have the ability to do partial fills in Massachusetts, which is helpful.
Is that an insurance issue? The pills are covered, and maybe not with dentistry, but with other things, it's harder to get coverage for physical therapy and other alternative forms of pain relief.
I think sometimes that's true. On the mass health side, that stuff's covered without a prior authorization. I do know a lot of the commercial carriers in Massachusetts have now started to make that available for the same reason. They see it as an alternative to what has clearly been an ineffective and, in some cases, for people, dangerous solution to the pain problem for many others. But I do think one of the things we are going to focus on and try and work on is, what are some alternatives we can make available for people, and help educate folks about what those alternatives are and what kinds of presenting circumstances they would work best in. Because for the chronic pain sufferers, it's a completely different conversation in my mind than it is for the short-term stuff.
Gotcha. Here's a question from someone on Twitter. She says, how can we encourage businesses to take a chance on hiring people in early recovery? I hadn't really thought about that, but is it a difficult road to get rehired when you're in recovery? Are businesses reticent to do that? And if so, what can we do about that? I've always been advised by my mother, especially, to not answer questions I don't know the answer to. But that's a hard question. It is a tough question. That's a very tough question.
What I would say is that, for the most part, I think employers, for the most part, try to be pretty, and there are laws in place as well, try to be pretty good about helping existing employees who end up with a problem with any kind of substance, okay? Alcohol, drugs, opioids, whatever it might be, go into treatment and find their way back to work. And there's legislation on this, there are regulations, and there are corporate best practices on this that have all moved very much to the support folks, help them get better, so that they can get back to work and be productive again. With respect to new hires, I guess that's a more complicated question because I would assume that no one's required under law to say anything about the fact that they're in recovery. But depending upon the nature of their recovery and what that requires them to do, that may factor into a conversation they would need to have with somebody in HR. I think I'm gonna have to parking lot that one and do a little homework on it. I mean, I'm literally processing.
Fair enough.
We have medical marijuana in Massachusetts,
right,
which is legal, and I do know there are people who deal with their employers on that issue because that's turned out to be an effective way for them to deal with pain and other issues like that. But even there, you run into issues with folks who do work with the federal government where you know, there are federal requirements associated with drug testing that factor into the medical marijuana space as well. That's a good question.
It is one. What role do you want to see the pharmaceutical companies play in the curbing of the opioid epidemic? Is there anything they can do here across the nation? Do you feel they should be funding recovery, funding treatment in any way as a result of having been involved at the beginning?
Well, I guess I'd start with how about do no harm, right? Stop promoting these medications with a far more tilted set of statements and promotional notions about the positive side of this stuff without talking at all or even downplaying the negative side of it. And I was pleased to see, I think Purdue said they were going to get out of the business of physician detailing on this, and I think that's great, but it's probably 15 years too late.
Right.
I think I know there's a ton of, Massachusetts is one of many states that are involved in all sorts of civil procedures with the manufacturers of these products. And we obviously support the work the Attorney General is doing there. I think I know there are folks in the pharma space who are working on non-narcotic alternatives to pain management. I hope they continue to do that. I think that's important. But I would like to see them be a lot more aggressive about, I'm not remembering the terminology here. There are certain kinds of medications in this space that are far less easy to crush and break. And,
oh, yeah. You can't tamper with them.
You can't tamper with them. Tamper-proof, thank you. I would like to see them get a lot more aggressive about pricing and promoting the tamper-proof stuff over the traditional stuff, because if you look at, they give lip service to that, but if you look at the way all this stuff is priced, for the most part, there's far more of the tamperable stuff in the market than the tamper-proof stuff in the market. But I would just like them out of the detailing business completely, and I would like them to acknowledge the fact that for very many people in the United States of America, those medications, improperly promoted, have caused an incredible amount of pain and harm and destruction.
Okay, we have about a minute. You can't just say money in answering this question. You were on the President's Commission. You worked very hard. You proposed many, many ideas, pardon me, of what could be done.
Yep.
We've seen, other than the law enforcement you've mentioned, we've seen very little movement. What do you need from the feds?
I would love to see, and I can't say money?
You can say money, but not just money.
Not just money, okay. I would love to see the feds get very aggressive about education, right? All the folks graduating from all those schools I talked about before. I would love to see everybody coming out of those schools have to take and pass a course in opioid therapy and pain management. The feds are in a position to make that. We did that in Massachusetts on a voluntary basis with all of our graduate schools. Their feds are in a position where they can make that happen nationwide. I would like to see them incorporated into all the CEU programming for everybody as a prescriber. I would like to see the, we're gonna figure out how to make recovery coaches a sort of embedded part of the way the healthcare system works in Massachusetts. I would love to see the feds get really aggressive about recovery coaches, because I think they are a huge opportunity, if we do this well, to really help people who get into recovery stay in recovery. I mean, many of the things that we're trying to do here in Massachusetts that we believe have been successful, the feds have a much bigger playing field and a much bigger opportunity to turn into reality around the rest of the country. The feds could give us the ability to put a standing order out there to make Narcan available over the counter. I mean, they have a lot of tools, and I guess what I would say is, now that we have a confirmed Health and Human Service Secretary, I would like to see Secretary Azar take this stuff and run with it.
Governor, thank you so much. That's all the time we have.
Thanks so much.
Really nice.
Thank you.
Next panel will be on in a moment.